Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this virtual IISS presentation. My name is Nigel Inkster. I'm Senior Advisor at IISS, and it's my pleasure to chair this presentation by Sir David Omand on the subject of How Spies Think, 10 Lessons. For those of you whose familiarity with the world of spying is watching the films of James Bond, Matthew Bourne et al., the idea of spies thinking may seem a little bit counterintuitive. And as a former spy myself, I must confess that I have occasionally wondered. But in all seriousness, the reality is that spies, do have to think an awful lot in particular ways, and there is nobody better placed to explain both how that works and, more importantly, what relevance it has for people generally, for the wider world, than Sir David Omand. One of the UK's most distinguished public servants with a long career in intelligence himself, in the Signals Intelligence Agency, GCHQ, which he directed for 7 years. David has also been occupied senior posts in the civil service, in the Ministry of Defence and the Home Office, where he was permanent Under Secretary, and also for a number of years as the first Intelligence and Security Coordinator. David now lectures at King's College on the questions related to intelligence, and has written a number of books, including Securing the State and Principled Spying. David will speak for some 20 to 25 minutes, followed by question and answer. And this entire event, both presentation and question and answer, will be on the record. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand the floor to David.
Well, thank you very much, Nigel. Delighted to be back talking the IISS, this time about my new book, How Spies Think, published last week by Penguin. I started thinking about this book after the Brexit referendum and the 2016 US presidential election, and seeing the way they were being reflected in social media. And I wanted to send out a call to arms in favor of more rational analysis to support decision-making and oppose what I saw as a rising tide of half-truths and distortions, seeking to persuade us online of what we ought to be thinking and wanting, and not to mention the downright falsehoods and deceptions that we were being fed, and not just coming from Russia, aimed at widening divisions in society and increasingly setting us at each other's throats. Now, I'm not naive, having spent a career in public service. The public has always aimed off in traditional political debate for a bit of political swagger and exaggeration of the benefits of some advocated policy. And we've always known that personal ambitions and rivalries are inseparable from the contest that's democratic politics. We see that at the moment. But we should not have to suffer those who blur or even deny the very nature of a fact. We're now in a world where respecting the truth no longer seems to be as important as creating the desired emotional impact. It's what the Rand Corporation called, in a report they wrote a year or so back, the spread of truth decay. It's a case where I would like it to be true, becomes with constant social media repetition, it might be true, and that slides too easily into it's as good as true. My book was more or less finished by the time COVID-19 hit us, but the question that I'm posing in the book, what do we need to know to take solid evidence-based decisions, has come back with a vengeance in the arguments between the professionals and the policymakers over how to manage the pandemic. As Nigel mentioned, I used to run GCHQ. I spent 7 years as a member of Britain's Joint Intelligence Committee, providing government with what it needed to know to inform national security decisions. Now, we all know that it's never the case that analysts will have all the information they would like to have. Lesson number one in intelligence is that our knowledge of the world is always fragmentary, incomplete, and is sometimes wrong. And that's obviously true of the information we use when we make personally any kind of decision. But I've watched intelligence analysts over the years succeed in reaching some good judgments, sound judgments, despite never having enough data. And I think we can all learn from their methods and acquire self-knowledge of the ways in which we're more likely to fall into error or to be deceived. It's interesting, in the arena of national security in government, we take great care, great pride in separating two types of thinking. We want the most impartial professional judgments possible, using all sources of information from the Joint Intelligence Committee, from the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, and other professional parts of government, such as today, the SAGE Committee of Scientists, to guide those who have to take the hard decisions. Of course, all we can know comes from our own personal sensory inputs. There's no other known way of getting information into our heads than through our senses. And thus, analysts cannot fully escape their unconscious emotional framing of issues, precisely because they're unconscious. But by understanding how they can fall into error, and by following the physician's Delphic command, first know yourself, analysts can reach a high standard of impartiality and truth-telling. We expect ministers and their policy advisors then to take heed of such analysis in pursuing their objectives. And of course, they will apply their political belief systems to their actual decisions, drawing on their democratic mandate. When it comes to making a personal decision, we have to bring these two different qualities of thought together in our own one head. On the one hand, rational analysis of the situation we're in, and on the other, our ambitions for what we want to achieve by a decision, or what outcomes we might fear and wish to avoid. And both kinds of thought, the dispassionate and the passionate, the is and the ought, need to be understood if we're to make sound decisions. Bringing these types of thinking together has always been hard, but my argument in the book is it's getting harder in the internet age. What we find online cannot be assumed to be objective evidence. It is so often designed to be emotionally manipulative. It's sometimes contradictory, and as we know, sometimes deliberately false. And it comes from more sources than ever. And that's as true about preparing to make choices in the polling booth as it would be choices on an online dating site. The problem today, therefore, is that the emotional part of the argument is leaching over to distort the rational part. And I remind us in the book why so much online content works at an emotional, not a rational level. It's a toxic combination when the inherent characteristics of the business model of the internet combine with human psychological vulnerability when online. We have algorithm-driven targeted advertising. That's what pays for the benefits we get, free at the point of delivery, services and queries. But it's our own personal digital data, online searches, viewing, sharing, liking, spending, that is being used to market stuff at us. Well, fair enough, but it's now being used to target politicized messages more precisely at us. The more outrageous the material, the more clicks it attracts, the less it costs the originator. And we're targeted with messages that the algorithms have revealed are most likely to trigger our emotional response. And very often without our realizing how we're being manipulated within our filter bubbles. So the internet is shaping our reality. It's not just a reflection of it. And that's why autocratic states like Russia and China can use their censored internets to help to control their populations. So back to the basic question in the book, what do we need to know to take solid evidence-based decisions? And the way in the book I've chosen to try and unpack this is to say that there are 4 outputs from using intelligence to reduce ignorance. And I'm using intelligence in a broad sense, our native wit, if you like. There are 4 ways that we can reduce our ignorance about a decision we face or a situation we face. And together they form what I've called the SEES model of intelligence, SEES, kind of reflecting what analysts are trying to do, to see. And these 4 outputs are situational awareness, that's the first S, explanation, the first E, estimation, and strategic notice. And they form together what I call the SEES model. And the first 4 chapters of the book looks in detail at each of these kinds of output. Situational awareness is the starting point. It's what is happening on the ground or in cyberspace, answering factual questions that start with what, when, and where. And obviously we need reliable, consistent situational awareness of what we face before we start arguing about what policy choices we may have over what to do about the situation. The British intelligence community puts significant effort into building systems to provide better situational awareness of the activity of malign actors, for example, hostile autocrats, terrorists, narcotics, human traffickers, proliferators, cyber gangs, and so on, all intent on doing things that will harm us and going to great lengths to prevent us knowing what they're up to. But if you think about COVID-19, we are presented daily with figures for daily cases, situational awareness. Very often the graph is flashed up in the briefing, and before you've had a chance to absorb the scale on the axis, it's gone down again. But what you've been left with is the graph going relentlessly upwards, giving you the emotional impact. Some of the data deserves scrutiny. We get the figures for daily cases, but by date, not when the test result is recorded, not the date when the sample was taken, which is what matters. And we don't get hospital admission numbers for the UK because they don't include Scotland. We get the deaths of those tested positive in the last 28 days from all causes, but not the figures for excess deaths compared with pre-COVID levels. Those figures are available, you can find them, but they're not necessarily the way the information is presented to us. And of course, what would be useful would be hotspot data, but we don't have that because the internet companies refused, on their own view of data privacy, to let the app record it. So situational awareness matters. And today we're going to have to get smarter at using our intelligence capabilities to reduce our ignorance of what's happening on the ground, and nowhere more so in what has been rather misleadingly called the grey zone. We've now got a new defense integrated strategic operating concept that General Nick Carter, the CDS, has introduced, and that has this concept in it of persistent engagement in cyberspace. So we are going to need to have very accurate situational awareness across the whole of that grey zone as to what is actually happening. It was drummed into me in theory of statistics classes at Cambridge many years ago that correlation is not causation. There's an important second lesson in intelligence that data needs explaining. Even hard facts, and quite a lot of intelligence doesn't quite qualify as a hard fact, but even hard facts are capable of multiple interpretations. Every defense lawyer knows this fact. the accused fingerprints were found on the fragments of a bottle thrown at the police. Was that because he threw it? Or was it just his old wine bottle that the mob spotted as they passed the recycling bin outside his house, as no doubt the defense lawyer will argue? So facts by themselves are dumb, and explanation is therefore the second output of my C's model, needed to support good decision-making, answering objectively questions about how and why. And for example, in relation to cyber attacks, who? Providing the judgments needed for supporting safe decisions. Is what has been seen in the data coincidence, or is this sign of a wider malign design by one of our adversaries? One of the problems here is that the choice of explanation of what we see can be easily swayed by our unconscious feelings and prejudices. In the book, I picked the example of the paranoid Cold War fantasies held by long-term CIA counterintelligence chief James Jesus Angleton and his British follower Peter Wright, author of Spycatcher. They believed that the Soviets assassinated Labour Party leader Hugh Gaitskell to allow Harold Wilson to become Prime Minister, since they'd convinced themselves he was a KGB agent, and therefore the Director General and the Deputy Director General of MI5 must also be Soviet agents, since they had not uncovered the alleged plot. Not surprising, since the plot did not exist. And it's important we don't make that kind of mistake in seeing everything that is happening in the grey zone as a reflection of some Russian or indeed Chinese master plan. Providing a sound evidence-based explanation involves methodically testing alternative explanations, alternative hypotheses against the data. You look for the explanation with the least evidence against it, not necessarily the one with the most in its favor. Obviously, if you look hard enough, as was done in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, you can always find some evidence that appears to support an argument, but it should only take one solid piece of contrary evidence to knock down an explanation. Explanation is hard. Very often you need access to background knowledge, foreign language skills, history, geography, anthropology, psychology, current affairs of the region or regime being studied. The explanation often boils down to assessing the motivation behind some observed act. For example, why does Russia use the illegal nerve agent Novichok as a murder weapon, given that its use points straight back to the Kremlin? But if you have a sound evidence-based explanation, you can be more confident in moving on to estimate, a word that I think everyone in the intelligence community prefers to predict, which carries the implication of somebody has a crystal ball. Well, no one has a crystal ball. The future is unknowable. But you can estimate how events might unfold within certain limits and on certain assumptions, provided you've got a good evidence-based explanation. So my third lesson in intelligence is about avoiding the inductive fallacy, just jumping from having seen some data points to assuming you know what is going to happen next. You need a good explanatory model, including explaining the motivations of the people behind whatever you're seeing, not just sufficient data. And estimates and modeling are therefore the third output of what I call C's, the second E in C's, to answer those vital questions about what's likely to happen next if we do or if we do not adopt a particular policy or act in a particular way. An example in the book is that of the Bosnian Serb army commander, General Mladic, known as the Butcher of Srebrenica. I was a member of the Joint Intelligence Committee at the time of the massacre at Srebrenica, and in July 1995, and we had to try and estimate what he would do next. 2 weeks later, I was with Air Chief Marshal Paddy Hine, Commander-in-Chief of Strike Command, along with our American and French opposite numbers, on a secret visit to Serbia to meet Mladic in a villa outside Belgrade. Our mission was to warn Mladic any further moves against UN safe areas would result in American, British, and French air power being unleashed on his forces, and to assess from his response whether he was likely to heed the warning. We had agreed that the airmen would wear aviator sunglasses and leather bomber jackets to increase the sense of menace, and that we would not touch the hospitality, sweetmeats and slivovich we knew we would be offered, a refusal that would be bound to offend. Mladic, in fact, made it easy to assess his motivation. Increasingly angry, he tore open his shirt with a cry of, "Well, kill me now if you must, but no foreign boot will desecrate the graves of my ancestors." And he read to us his handwritten account of the tribulations of the Serb people at the hands, and indeed their defeat at the hands of the Ottoman army in 1389 in the Battle of the Field of Blackbirds. Memories are long. He delivered a racist declaration that the Bosnian Muslims, or Turks as he called them, had no right to be in his country, and he was determined simply to drive them out. So we flew back late at night from our mission, having reached our assessment that to stop his ethnic cleansing, nothing short of full-scale NATO intervention would do, which is, of course, what then happened. And Mladic is now serving a life sentence for crimes against humanity. Finally, whilst we're focusing on those first three outputs, situational awareness, explanation, and estimation, very often something comes and hits us on the back of the head that we had not expected. So to complete the outputs from intelligence that we need is strategic notice of possible future challenges that might come and hit us. Strategic notice helps military and procurement planning. It helps answer important questions of the how could we best prepare for whatever might appear next, or could we preempt this risk so that it never comes to test us? Much of the information for that strategic notice comes from open sources, sometimes underpinned by sensitive secret sources, but it emphasizes the need for the intelligence community to reach out to talk to the academic community. But the fourth lesson in intelligence is that if you devote effort to acquiring strategic notice and use it, we do not have to be so surprised by surprise itself. One of the advantages of using the SEAS model to unpack thinking, rational thinking, is that each of those four outputs suffers from rather different problems, making errors easier to uncover. And I won't go through it now, but the second part of the book essentially looks at the reasons why, despite our best efforts, we can get it wrong. In government, professional analysis and policy making are different domains, as I've said, and sometimes you can see that these domains find it difficult to understand each other. We can also see that today in the arguments over what to do about COVID-19. The processes of analysis can seem abstract and remote from the media-dominated world of the politician, but what analysts see is too often policy driven by magical thinking, believing the objective can be obtained as soon as it's announced, without checking that the real world mechanisms and the resources are on the ground that are capable of securing it. Sometimes there can be specific warning failures that fall into the cracks between adequate foreknowledge and appropriate precautionary action, cases of hearing but not listening. I have a sixth lesson in intelligence, which is that we're all susceptible to obsessive states of mind. And these days we need really to understand the enduring appeal of conspiracy theories and why it is that social media encourages their genesis and spread. And there's a chapter on that in the book. And the seventh lesson is very much about deception and faking. Seeing is not always believing. And then finally, in the final section of the book, I apply this learning to issues such as how do you build long-term partnerships? How do you conduct negotiations that will arrive at a win-win outcome that will last? And the final lesson in intelligence is the reminder, which we must always have in mind, that the threats from subversion and sedition now come in digital form and with digital amplification. To conclude, Buddhists teach that there are three poisons that cripple the mind: anger, attachment, and ignorance. Emotions such as anger can blind us to what is true and what is false. Attachment to old ideas with which we feel comfortable can falsely reassure us that the world is predictable and can blind us to threatening developments. And that's what causes us to be badly taken by surprise. But it's ignorance that is the most damaging mental poison. And the purpose of emphasizing rational analysis in the way that I describe in the book and present in the SEAS model is to reduce such ignorance, thereby enabling us to safeguard our digital future. Nigel, I'll stop there and very happy to discuss any or all of that.
I managed to mute myself so that I would not degrade the signal more than necessary. Thank you very much. That covered a very wide array of issues, and as you argue in the book, all of them to varying degrees pertinent to all of us in the ways that we go about making sense of the world in which we find ourselves and making the decisions that we have to make. I'd like to pick up, we've got plenty of time for questions, and those of you who wish to do so, you can use the digital method. If you click on the participants at the bottom of your screen, you will then get you can open the question and answer window, and that enables you to type a question, which we can pick up on, or raise your hand in the webinar, alert the panelists that we want to ask a question. I should warn you that my vision is not the greatest, so it may take me a little time to pick up. I apologize for that, but please do put forward your questions by whatever means. But I'd like to pick up on a couple of points. One that you addressed directly, the other by implication. And the first one was, you know, the challenge of seeing the world from the other guy's point of view. I'm old enough, you know, like you, I sat in the Joint Intelligence Committee around the green baize table for, you know, many times. And it seemed to me that that was always one of the biggest challenges that we faced. The Foreign Office used to have this term, the Wikimist Fallacy, which really kind of described a situation in which you know, a British policymaker would be talking with a foreign counterpart, and that foreign counterpart would be dressed in a nicely cut suit, speaking immaculate English, and the temptation would then be to presume that that person saw the world in exactly the same way that you did. And the reality was, as you pointed out in the Serb example, that this is rarely the case. So getting to see, you know, see the world from the other person's point of view, I've always thought is one of the most important duties intelligence has to perform, but also one of the most difficult, because it does require such a kind of mental and emotional shift. And I wonder if there's more you can say about that. The other thing that I thought about, you talked about the barrage of disinformation and malign activity that's taking place online. And I wanted particularly to raise the point about deliberate disinformation campaigns by foreign governments, Russia, China, etc. In a recent interview in the Financial Times, the outgoing chief of SIS, Alex Younger, talked about this and seemed to suggest was asked about this and seemed to suggest in his reply that there might be less to this than meets the eye in terms of the impact these campaigns are actually having. And I just wonder if you had any thoughts on that point.
Taking your first point, Nigel, it's the reason really I put a whole chapter in the book on this, is the problems of transferred judgment and mirror imaging. The other is not like us for most of the targets that intelligence is looking at. And indeed, if you're buying a used car, it is very tempting to assume that the person on the other side of the table in the garage has the same objectives as you have. They don't. Those large sums spent payment compensation for mis-selling of insurance products and so on, all stem from the fact that hapless individuals assumed that the motivations of the person on the other side were the same and that they had their best interests in mind. Well, clearly only up to a point, and bonuses came into it as well. And the trick in the great gift, I think, of empathy, which members of your former service certainly had, is to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the other. It's hard, I think, for an analyst sitting in Whitehall who may never have visited the country being written about, let alone actually met face-to-face the leaders of that country, to realize that people could sit down and quite somberly and with due motivation do things which are pretty unspeakable. It doesn't come naturally. In the book, I cite the example of 1968 and the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia to crush the Dubček Prague Spring. And the analysts knew the tanks were on the border. They knew a lot about the preparations that had been made, but the crucial judgment was, is this just arm twisting and coercion, or is it a genuine attempt to cross the border and impose Soviet rule, arrest Dubček and cart him off to Moscow, which is what happened. I was driving an aged Land Rover at the time along that very border with some student friends, and we were dodging in and out of Soviet tank columns. We didn't know, and nor did the Joint Intelligence Committee in London, whether they would cross the border. And the key assumption made by the analysts was the influence of international opinion and UN criticism, which would follow an intervention. And it turned out that, particularly with Andropov as a key figure involved in running the KGB, they didn't care about that as much as they cared about the integrity of their rule over Eastern Europe. So that's a sort of classic case. So I think assuming the other is like us and assuming they will make the kind of judgment call we would make is an error. But you can train yourself out of that, I think, once you know what it is. I'm not sure I'm fully with the argument that online subversion doesn't have an effect. I think there's short-term impact of particular measures, which individually may well not sway a lot of people. But there's the long-term impact of it being known that this kind of subversive activity is going on, which undermines trust in arguments, it undermines trust in institutions. I don't think you can have a good functioning democracy if you haven't got confidence in the kind of the arguments that are being put forward by, say, the different parties. So once you have that germ of suspicion there of manipulation, that can grow. And in today's US election, this has reached the stages of paranoia amongst parts of the population. So I think it is a dangerous, it's something that we have to stand up to, find ways of inoculating the population so they understand what's going on. I would start, as I say in the book, with schools, teaching critical thinking in schools and making sure that every child has some awareness of how it is that the information they see on social media arrived there. And I don't think it's very difficult to do that, but it requires a deliberate curriculum to put that over. We certainly, and here I would agree with Alex Younger, if what he was implying is don't ascribe all this to a master plan. And that's really why I picked the James Jesus Angleton story, because he was convinced there was a Soviet spider spinning an enormous web of deception, and thus wrote off the Sino-Soviet rapprochement. You know, this is all designed to fool the West. It's not really taking place. And Sino-Soviet split. The assumption that your adversary is 10 feet tall, this is just falling into the very trap that they're inviting you to step into. So we've got to be careful about that. And that's one of the things that worries me about offensive cyber, that once we start to think that every potential intrusion, every testing of the boundaries of some defense system is part of some enormous campaign, we could actually get the thing out of proportion.
Indeed, yes. So in your experience in the real world of government, should lead one to conclude that cock up trumps conspiracy every time.
Yeah. It would be nice if there were fewer cock-ups as well, but they're not all conspiracies.
Okay, we've got some questions coming in, and if you bear with me, I have the first one from Masato Kimura. How do you think, what do you think about the idea of a 6 eyes arrangement, including Japan? And would Japan be able to contribute usefully to such an arrangement? Now, I know that in the book, you do actually talk at some length about your experience with the 5 eyes, and you know, the way in which that works. And you know, so maybe I'll ask you to take that one first of all.
Yes, it's a very good question, and the same kind of question has been addressed by other countries. France, for example, why shouldn't France be? And for a while, it looked like French leadership was indeed suggesting such a thing. One of the points I make in the book is that the trustworthiness that you need to establish to have the kind of relationship, particularly in, say, digital intelligence that we have with the United States, takes generations to acquire. You can't just sign a piece of paper and expect 5 has become 6. There have been quite a lot of ups and downs in the course of putting the 5 eyes together. So that's the first point. The second point is there already are very good arrangements in the Far East and in East Asia for intelligence sharing with the United States at their heart. And it's probably better to think of building on that than the historically, if you like, Atlantic-centered UK-US relationship, with Australia in now a very sensitive and key geographic position. There may well be a case for deepening intelligence cooperation between Australia, Japan, United States, Taiwan, and other nations that have an interest in the region. But I would slightly counsel against just simply saying you can make 5 into 6 or into 7 or into 8 without changing the nature of the relationship, which is historically based.
Yeah, thanks very much. The next one I've got is from Desmond Bowen. Arriving at a rational assessment usually takes time, but in a crisis, analysts and policymakers are time poor. What is your guidance for avoiding being bounced into premature judgment?
Well, it's easy to sit and pontificate on this. I've been there, so I know just how hard it is, and I know Desmond's been there as well. I mean, the starting point, don't start from here. Mm-hmm. So, how much effort has already gone in to building up the database, to understanding the subject? And that takes us back to the sensible use of strategic notice. It's usually the case that the crises that hit the United Kingdom tend to come from areas of the world that we haven't devoted as much intelligence effort to as we should have done. But sometimes, as with after the first Gulf War, we should perhaps have kept a slightly greater degree of focus. How quickly can you get situational awareness, which is my first category. And sometimes in some kinds of crisis, that really does satisfy a big ministerial need. We've just had an attack in Vienna. So the first 6 hours of reporting was very confused. If it's possible to provide situational awareness of what, when, and where, that's reasonably reliable, that in itself is a very valuable analytic output. And then the explanation part, sometimes you can't do that quickly. You just have to say to minister, we cannot ascribe responsibility for this attack at the moment. We haven't got the basic intelligence to do that, the data to do that, and you work on it. And as we saw with the Skripals, you really remarkably quickly, a case can be put together and you can arrive at a firm judgment on which policy action can be taken and taken internationally. So every sympathy with analysts having to respond very quickly, but that doesn't mean that if you don't know, you shouldn't be saying, we can't say. Time and again, I've seen ministers in front of a television camera after some domestic incident. They've only got half the picture. And one of my rules is the first reports from the scene are always wrong in some significant way. And Desmond will remember 7/7 and the fact that the explosion in the tunnel was reported at the stations at either end. And therefore, double the number of attacks was initially reported. So you do have to be, I think, careful there. But there's no magic answer to that. But having enough analysts to be able to focus on it quickly, who know something about the subject area, is important. And I observe that in the last few years, the Cabinet Office analytic capability supporting the JOC has significantly increased. There are more analysts. And that, I think, answers a long-term concern I have, that we've spent too much collecting intelligence and not enough on the skilled people to analyze it.
Thank you very much. The next one is about COVID. It's from Miguel Martinez. And it says, the management of the pandemic by Western governments has been disastrous, especially compared to China and other Asian countries. Are we falling much behind? How do we compare ourselves to them in terms of intelligence?
Very interesting question. I'm not sure I've got all the data points I would need to answer it. But if you, from what I know of, say, the Taiwanese response, they moved very quickly. They sent a team into China. They tried to establish as best they could very quickly. And then they were pretty draconian in imposing restrictions on a population that appears to have been predetermined to follow the advice because they seemed to have a better psychological understanding of what a pandemic would do from previous experience. So they don't have virtually any live cases at the moment. Life is continuing. Mask wearing is obligatory socially, not because the government has said so, but because it is part of the culture that if there's a pandemic around, you wear face masks. So they've done very well, and you can't ascribe that to, as it were, authoritarian, Chinese authoritarianism in order to explain that. They're always at risk, of course, of follow-on other waves. They have imported cases where people return with the virus, but they seem to have a track and trace system and testing system that works very effectively. This seems to be something that certainly the UK and France have both struggled with. Germany seems to have done rather better. And that inability to scale up a system which in normal times you would only need in very small scale for Legionnaire's disease or the occasional outbreak of food poisoning or an imported case of a tropical disease. We couldn't scale it up. We didn't have the right plans. And I suspect when there's an inquiry, as eventually there undoubtedly will be into the whole episode, that will be shown to be one of the problems. And then you combine that with a government that is essentially libertarian in its views, that doesn't want to restrict personal freedom. That's admirable sentiment, but it may have led to some greater delay in realizing that life just could not be allowed to continue as normal. The IISS published a very interesting analysis of the early stages that Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman put together in Survival. And that's, I think, the best account I've read of why we seem to have been caught slightly behind the curve.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got a question from Grenville Byford, which goes, how are resources allocated between your two S's and two E's? And is this the right allocation?
I think the first three, it's not resource allocation that's really the issue. And there are some cases where the data points, the meaning of the data points speak for themselves. The real resource challenge is between the final S, strategic notice, people looking at the longer term, at developments in global politics, developments in technology, and then trying to work out what would be the national security implications if, say, quantum computing at scale suddenly became possible. The focus has to be, is driven to the here and now. Ministers have short-term objectives. The boundary of the next election or the next election but one is a serious constraint on the amount of emotional energy that is put into the longer term. But there are some very significant, other than COVID, some very significant long-term issues, many associated with climate change and species diversity. And I hope somebody has the time really to look at those. So we're not just focused on the current. Now, is that the intelligence community that should be doing that? I think it's a joint enterprise between the scientific community, because many of the issues relate to technology, the intelligence community that has a methodology and a way of looking at issues, and the outside academic world, because much of the information you need is open source for that longer term look. And the think tanks like IISS and the academic world really have to be invited in as co-creators of risk registers and sort of policy papers about what might be done to preempt. And the other point worth making is I fall into the trap in speaking to you that I mentioned in the book, which is we always think of these things as being bad things, whereas actually sometimes they're opportunities. And the ability to spot something in the longer term over the horizon, that if we actually organized the research and we organized ourselves, we could actually take real opportunity from. That should be part of the picture. But unfortunately, the intelligence community, it's usually bad things that they're looking out for.
Yeah. Okay, and another question from Samuel Armstrong. What differences do you think there are in the ways spies from the UK's different intelligence services think? Do our spies think differently?
That's a very interesting question, and
feel free to have a blast at SIS. I won't take offence.
No. The serious answer, which has been pushed, it's a case that's been made by the present director of GCHQ very firmly in the public domain, is diversity of minds. So you need lots of different kinds of people with different kinds of thinking, and the great art is how you get them all together to focus on a single target. We have an intelligence community that is much more of a community than it was in my day, even as coordinator. I spent a lot of time trying to pull the agencies together. But the idea of joint mission planning, of saying there is a national target out there, it might be proliferation group, it might be terrorists, it might be a hostile state or its proxy. And the community itself needs to get together and say, what is the best way of acquiring intelligence on that target? And then you begin to put the different kinds of thinking. The sort of people you want to recruit to SIS are different from the sort of people you probably want to recruit to GCHQ, and different again from the security service, not least because SIS officers will have to spend most of their careers abroad. But and have a facility with languages, which may be helpful in the other agencies, but isn't perhaps necessarily so central. And the ability to work on your own or in very small groups is different from the team sport that is largely the work of the security service. So there are these differences, but the key message is no one kind of mind is going to be able to deliver what you want. You've got to have a diversity of minds and the leadership to be able to bring them together. That would be my answer.
And actually, just to interject briefly, that certainly was my own experience. That some of the best work I ever did was when we combined the skills of my service with the very different but equally important skills of agencies like GCHQ. So it wasn't, I always used to say it was not either or, it's always got to be both and. Yeah. We've got another question actually on the subject of SIGINT, which I think is very pertinent, and from Frank Asbeck, and it goes, what is your assessment about the future role of SIGINT in view of the evolution of encryption technology and public access to it?
Yeah, very good question. We call it SIGINT. We're really talking about digital intelligence, and particularly that acquired from packet switched internet networks. It's not solely that, and the ability to attack from an intelligence point of view, attack the devices that people use, and particularly their laptops and mobile devices and so on. And that let me start again. If you think about intelligence techniques in that domain, what's new about our current internet-dominated digital world. In the Second World War, we had geolocation of enemy units. It was called direction finding. We had traffic analysis of the Warsaw Pact's communications, which we couldn't read, but we knew who was communicating with whom. That's called communications data analysis. So many of the techniques, the approaches to deriving intelligence are common. What is new is the scale of information that can be coped with and the speed with which that information can be processed and intelligence inferred, which is completely new. We've never been able to think about terabytes and terabytes of data per second flowing down these pipes, and yet the ability of smart algorithms to filter the data and then pose intelligent questions to the data to derive intelligence, or to be able to send remotely malware which will allow access to, say, a terrorist's laptop. So if you call it signals intelligence, is not dependent and has never been since days of the Second World War, so dependent on being able to read the content of messages. Soviet mainline traffic was largely, unless people made major mistakes, and human error sometimes creeps in, but Soviet mainline traffic was not accessible to any of the Western agencies because the Soviet Union knew perfectly well how to produce strong cryptography. But we still derived the order of battle of the group of Soviet forces in Germany down to subunits to provide the British Army on the Rhine and Allied forces with a very detailed picture of the forces that were arrayed against them. And the same is true with terrorists and proliferators and other criminals with mobile devices. You can derive a lot of information from that analysis. And the other thing worth mentioning is that there's a vast amount of data about us as individuals known by the machines. Our travel, our use of plastic cards, our virtually everything about our life, our internet searches, and that's all known, as it were, by the machines, and that's how the internet works, as I was saying a moment ago. And if you're interested in intelligence on individuals, terrorists and serious criminals and so on, there's a whole trove of information there that with the right legal authority, with the right warrant, you can access. It's not a hopeless task, and we rely on the ingenuity of people working in that field to keep coming up with things that the bad guys don't know are possible.
Okay, David, thanks very much. There are some more questions outstanding, but I'm afraid we've actually reached our limit, and I'm mandated to finish punctually because we need to make space to prepare for another event. So reluctantly, because we could clearly continue this, I'd like to wrap up and thank you for this very insightful presentation. Having read the book myself, I can only urge everyone else who's interested in these matters to read it. It's an eminently readable publication, and there's a lot of wisdom. There we go. In there. So thank you very much for taking the time to make this presentation, and thank you to all those of you who have taken part and listened. I'm sorry I wasn't able to cover all the questions, but I'm sure if you read the book, you may derive some insights into the issues that concern you. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nigel. It's a pleasure.